a spider almost thinks with their web, and that if you damage a part of the spider's web, they've done studies on it, and the spider acts as if they themselves have been damaged. So it's as if the web is kind of their brain extending out into the world. And our nervous systems are like that too, via our senses. They're the way that we connect to the world outside of us. You know, a symptom exists inside the body in relationship to everything else, and can only really be understood in relationship to everything else. A symptom taken out of context doesn't make sense. Just like if you take an animal out of the savannah and put it inside a zoo, it's going to act completely differently.
Hello, and welcome to Sacred Herbalism, the full moon segment of the Elder Tree podcast, where we explore how plants can support us to enter into a sacred relationship with life and the living world. I'm Stephanie Hazel, and I've recorded this episode beneath the gaze of epic Wollumbin, where I live in Bundjalung country, and I pay my respects to the First Nations people of this land, as well as to the spirits and plants of this ancient earth. If you love what we do, you can support the Elder Tree mission of putting medicine in the hands of the people by joining our Patreon, where you can access special teachings from our presenters and our interviewees. So, let's walk into the moonlit forest together. Are you ready? The stories we tell matter. The stories about health, healing, culture, plants not only affect the way we think about things, but our actual experience of being alive and being embodied. I know that if I take a plant while thinking primarily about the stories of the scientific constituents, then those qualities are amplified. But when I take a plant thinking primarily about the myth and the poetry and the psycho-spiritual aspects of that plant, then that is what comes alive for me in that moment. And it's not just stories about plants that we need to be thinking about as herbalists. When we talk about illness and healing, we are reinforcing different kinds of stories and our clients and our own experience of what it is to be alive in a body. These are the things that motivate and really inspire Miriam Latif, my interviewee today. She's a curious and cunning herbalist currently planted on Wurundjeri country, and she's deeply trained in the myth, mystery, and medicine of the Western herbalist tradition. In this conversation, we talk about stories of gods and plants and Athens. We talk about systems thinking and linear models of thought and approaches to understanding healing. I think this conversation is really important. Systems thinking and the ability to understand complex causes for outcomes really makes a difference to our ability to be good healers, to see the unseen of the way things interact with each other in the body, in the mind, and in our community. In fact, Miriam's mission is to help herbalists shift the current healing paradigms to not merely focus on individual bodies, but the collective body which we all inhabit. You can find her at Understory. Welcome, Miriam. So great to have you here.
Thanks, Steph.
When we're really deeply connected as herbalists to the plants as beings, to the way that the plants can bring us alive to the sacredness and the beauty of life. When we are working with plants as allies in our work rather than as medical tools. So some of these things we've been exploring in this herbal medicine, this Sacred Herbalism podcast has been around plants as beings that we can ally with. Plants as gateways and teachers of the sacredness of life. Most of the conversations I've had have been about how that's important and beautiful for us as herbalists. And I'm just curious whether you have any thoughts around how that's useful for us in clinic. Like, how does that change how we work with our clients?
After I finished at uni, I did 3 years with our mutual mentor, Jimmy Wollumbin, and I got really deep inside the Western tradition as it was formalized in ancient Greece, so the Hippocratic tradition, if we wanted to put a box around it, sort of thing. And a really beautiful aspect of that is thinking of plants as gods. And I really love the quote by a Greek philosopher whose name is Thales, and he said, "There are gods in all things." And, that applies to plants as well. And there are gods in us as well. And at any one time, we are occupied or can be driven by these gods, whether it's, Aries raging in your histamine, or Aphrodite raging inside your estrogen, or whatever it is. There are these forces that can take up residence inside of us, or at least that's one way of looking at it anyway. And I think a particularly poetic and beautiful way of looking at it. And so in that way, plants are an are a dynamic or a force that can be invited into our being in order to help us balance, and in order to help us honor the entire spectrum, honor the entire pantheon. Our culture is very monotheistic. It really encourages us to operate in one mode a lot of the time. And that mode is very solar. It's very Apollonian. It's very trending towards doing, being, making, producing, getting noticed, getting approved of all the time. There's no room for the lunar gods, perhaps, or those moments of rest or stillness necessarily. We can choose to do those things in our personal lives, but culturally, we're very geared towards production, validation, recognition, all those things. I know, I notice that inside myself all the time. And
Absolutely.
yeah, right. It's there. I'm not like apart from any of this, and so I think that affects our bodies. And I think that too long spent in one mode can have really, at least, imbalancing effects. Or in other words, if you build a temple to one god, the other gods are going to get angry. And so I like to think of plants as gods that can help us add some diversity, or build some different temples inside of us, because I love this idea of health being a movement between different states of being, right? There's the entire pantheon there for us to honor: the sun gods, or the storm gods, and the river gods, and the lunar gods, and all of them. And I think nature is diverse, that's why it thrives. Ecology requires diversity to be alive and to function. And so this idea that, yeah, plants can offer us contact with forces that, yeah, we have forgotten to come in contact with for a long time, whether that be for cultural reasons or personal reasons. They're often obviously linked.
I love that. The plants as gods and health as a movement between a diversity of states. And totally in our culture, we've cast health as being able to be in maximum productivity at all times.
Yeah, yeah.
Like a healthy person is one who can achieve everything they want to achieve,
Mm.
who never gets sick. People say, "Oh yeah, I'm really healthy, I never get sick."
Yes, yeah.
And I think, "Oh, that's interesting." I don't necessarily think of health as never getting sick.
Absolutely.
And there are some quite dysfunctional patterns that can show up as never actually getting sick.
Totally, absolutely. All health is defined and influenced by the cultural values of that time. And I really think that uh, we lose touch with something really important when we define health, as endless productivity or never getting sick, or that trope of like, I hope you're well. I think it really excludes a lot of people as well, and a lot of gods.
A lot of aspects of what it is to be alive.
Exactly.
I've definitely been working a lot with this idea of plant allies, as I think everyone listening would know. And working with that with my students and my clients of not just the way that I practice, but the way that I give them the herbs. So, let's pick a herb that would be a great god drugs to explore. So, maybe someone who's struggling with focus and energy, and they want something to help them with brain function. And if I feel like there's a good alignment with Tulsi's a plant that I really love as a gentle kind of vata appropriate brain stimulator. And Tulsi's a really sacred plant. So, and offering them a single plant and being like, hey, why don't you try this plant for a few weeks? And here, let me tell you some stories about Tulsi. Tulsi is like the Lakshmi of the Indian tradition, and she is a beautiful, gentle being of spiritual purity. And in a way, she's like, and everyone in India, in Western India, they have Tulsi growing in the garden in like an altar pot, and the women come and light candles and offer milk and honey every day. Like, that hundreds and thousands of people are doing this every day to the Tulsi plant. So for me, Tulsi has this interesting, mythological, mythopoetic capacity to help us connect with our own inner sacred space. And from that place, a lot of clarity and focus can come, right? It's very different from an adrenal, as you said, like Aries, let's have a triple shot coffee and, run around the block 3 times and then get all our work done. It's a very different energy. And so for me in clinic, like working with plants in this way, obviously I work with herbs in other ways too. Here's a formula for your endometriosis, right? But there's something really beautiful in being like, here, I'm introducing you to a new friend. This is a being who will support you in all of this mythopoetic ways to access these other spaces of yourself, which are vital for your well-being. And all you need to do is take this plant and use this plant support to be able to access this other part of yourself that you've disconnected from. And it takes a lot of confidence to offer a plant like that to someone who's coming for like fatigue and brain fog, right? To be like, hey, wait a second. And not everyone's going to respond, but actually I think that there's something really powerful in that, because that is if that's the right herb for them, you're offering a client a relationship that will continue to bear fruit way past the relationship that person has with you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think when you offer plants in this context, there's a part of us, a very, very deep part of us, that awakens and relates so much more to story and myth than it does to data and information. And so if you're giving somebody a Tulsi plant and you're telling them, about its physiological actions and its constituents, I feel like that doesn't awaken aliveness in the plant or the person, as opposed to if you tell them the stories around that plant and maybe the myth behind it. I think also like we really rob the world of beauty, when we leave out those parts of a plant's story, and when we stop evoking like beautiful language around plants and around medicine and around how we see the body. We crave story. I think story is, there's a list of like 7 things that are universal to cultures around the world, and storytelling is one of them. So obviously storytelling is like a very, very deep part of how we function as a culture, of what nourishes our soul. Like I said, it's poetic, it brings beauty. I really think beauty is lacking from medicine, and I think that's why we look so much to places like China or India for things like Chinese medicine or Ayurveda. Why those things seem so attractive, because they are so rich with poetry and beauty in terms of systems and medicine. But yeah, it's also really important to know that our Western tradition is full of so much beauty and poetry as well. Yeah, so I think, offering plants in the context of their beauty and in the context of their story can really help, like you said, shift things for people, or access, again, a part of us that doesn't get to be accessed much in modern Western culture. And that's kind of where the healing and the medicine can be, because we're bringing something online that is really dusty, and has been long ignored and long neglected.
Yeah. Are there any plants in your life that you feel really connected to, that are doing this work for you at the moment?
Absolutely, olive leaf, or the whole olive tree, really. Before we started recording, I was telling you that my practice with connecting to plants has fallen by the wayside a bit. So what I did was like All right, I'm not just gonna try connect to plants, plural. I'm just gonna try connect to one plant, and that plant for me is the olive tree. And when I moved into this house about a year and a half ago, there was an olive tree planted in the backyard, and I love olive. I've not had like this experience of a plant really like calling out to you, um, except with olive leaf, to the point that she's just like in my mind a lot of the time. It's just there. um, I love that so much of the plant, uh, has a use. So there's the wood, there's the leaves, there's the beautiful olives. um, I have like really visceral memories of uh, cycling through Morocco, which I did for my honeymoon, and just smelling like the olive groves and coming across like these gnarly old olive trees that had been growing for God knows how long. They're a tree that has been with humans for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. Um, and my favorite thing to eat is bread and olive oil. And there's something also, olive is a plant sister for me, or a plant ancestor. It's very, I'm Egyptian, and so it is very much there in my lineage as well. And all that stuff is even before we go through like the extremely long list of medicinal values that olive leaf has. So much more than how it's been pigeonholed as an immune system plant. It's an incredible medicine.
I imagine there's a lot of amazing myth and story about olive trees too, right?
There is
What are there
absolutely.
any that are alive for you at the
I
moment?
do know that the Greek myth. So olive is kind of the tree of the goddess Athena, and I believe the story was, and I might butcher it a little bit, but it's actually interesting that you asked, because in trying to connect with olive tree, I was like, I also really want to learn how to tell its story, or how to tell some of the myth around it. And so I believe, Athens is Athena's city, and there was a kind of godly. She's usually depicted as a war goddess, but she's a bit more complex than that. She's very chaste. She's very strong. She's very bold. And in terms of olive leaves medicine, I think it just really speaks to the strength in kind of ancestry, and the strength in something that is so deeply rooted, that has been there for so long. There's a kind of stoicness to it.
Mm.
And I think olive leaf medicine really teaches us to have our roots run really deep.
Mm.
And to have a kind of staying power. And not necessarily strength in terms of you can run faster or jump higher, but the strength that you get from mm, deep wisdom, and really connecting to your roots.
When I think of olive groves that I've seen in Italy
Mm.
or Morocco, there is this quality. They're quite small trees for how ancient they are, right?
Mm.
And they're gnarled, and they are providing goodness for hundreds of years, and they're just like they're in quite inhospitable lands often,
Mm-hmm.
like often quite arid, often really windy, and you can see the kind of gnarled and almost stunted way that they grow is speaking to their incredible resilience over a really long period of time in the face of kind of harsh conditions
Mm.
as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Mm.
What is the way that you would use olive leaf medicinally?
Mhm. I love using it in quite a traditional sense. So it is cooling and heat clearing. So that's why it is really good for infections and for the immune system. That infections traditionally, because of the kind of activity that they cause inside the body, are often associated with heat. And I remember one time a good friend had come down with Ross River fever, and she was experiencing a lot of heat and a lot of fever. And another cool thing about olive leaf is that the way that it drains heat is through the bowels. And that's a very sort of traditional or kind of Hippocratic way of looking at things, this kind of idea of purging the body so that heat can be released. And so I brought her over. I think it was either the tincture of olive leaf or a bunch of olive leaves to boil into a tea, which is another thing that I love about olive. It's like, it's especially down here in Melbourne, it's in every, yaya's
Everywhere.
front yard, kind of thing. And so it's super accessible. But she took the olive leaf, and it acts as a mild laxative as well. So it's not a really strong laxative like senna or anything like this, but it's a mild laxative that can help release heat through the bowels. And so that had a laxative effect on her, and really helped release some of the heat of the fever and the pain in the joints and stuff like that. So I like to use olive leaf in that way, as that kind of like mild laxative heat clearing sort of aspect. Like you said, that bitterness and its ability to kind of move stagnation and a sluggish liver, and have a really wonderful effect on the circulatory system as well. It's like, God, I think it's called um, oleopurin. It's one of the most sort of powerful kind of antioxidants out there as well. So in addition to using it for like those specific sort of patterns or symptoms, I think it's like an incredible, it's like the original superfood, olive leaf, just because it's so full of antioxidants. It has such also like quite a tonifying effect on the circulatory system as well.
Mm.
I think it's like a wonderful thing to take. Like I drink olive leaf tea daily. I go out to my tree and I'll just lightly and gently simmer the leaves, because they've got a kind of toughness to them, the leaves as well. So they're not one where I would like boil the water and kind of add them after. I sort of just gently simmer them a little bit, and I drink it daily just because of that beautiful antioxidant action as well.
Mm. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey towards becoming a herbalist.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I guess I just started becoming interested in not even necessarily alternative health, but just alternative ways of being, going through my, young hippie phase in my late teens and early 20s. I studied, I mean, I've been on an interesting like educational journey. It definitely didn't start with plants and medicine. I studied theatre and media when I was young, and then I went on to study community cultural development. And I think I've always had a leaning towards being interested in how cultures function, the narratives that exist in cultures, what that means for people, and how they interact and relate, and how we build community, and how we be together.
Can I ask,
Yeah.
what was it that really drew you towards herbal medicine specifically? Like, what was that call that you felt inside yourself?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've always been surrounded by medicine. My grandpa was a doctor, my dad was a doctor, my uncle's a doctor. Um, and so the human body has been something that has always interested me, and the way it functions, of course, and anatomy and physiology and health. As I said, at the time I was living off grid in like a really dodgy, moldy little shack on top of a mountain in Queensland. So really lean towards self sustainability, I guess, and really wanting to be able to take care of myself in terms of living off grid and homesteading. And, I guess a natural progression of that was being able to grow my own medicine, and being able to, in a basic and self proficient kind of way, know what was going on in my body and be able to access things, whether they were plants that I grew or things that I could, find in the bush, to be able to take care of myself. So I guess it was that kind of self sufficiency piece
Mm.
that really drew me towards herbal medicine when I look back and I think about it. And that was kind of congruent with what was going on in my life at the moment, as well as that background of just, yeah, being interested in medicine and the body and how it functions.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very hard to be self sufficient with pharmaceutical medicine because you're reliant on a massive pharmaco industrial complex to be able to produce the medicines that we rely on, right?
Absolutely. And there's something just really beautiful and simple about going out and, being like, I have a bellyache or I'm feeling a little bit anxious. I'm going to go out and pick this plant, or, I've got a bit of a chesty cough. Let me, steam some eucalyptus leaf or something like that as I was living, because we were quite isolated up on our mountaintop. And so just to be able to have access to those things, it just felt good.
Yeah.
It was nice. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. And yeah, it felt really nice to be supported just by what was around me.
Mm. Yeah, to be that's a kind of relationship, right? Like to be able to be feeding yourself from your garden and supporting yourself or being supported by the land that you live on and a part of. That's like, I don't know, I feel like it's a basic aspect of humanity that we've really lost touch with.
Mm,
And that's why 80% of the world use herbal medicine as their primary medicine. That's a
mm,
World Health Organization statistic, as you would
mm,
know. 80%
mm,
of the world uses herbal medicine. And it's
mm.
not because they've bought the Kool-Aid of, natural is best. It's
Yeah.
because that's what is accessible to them.
Mm,
That's what's
mm,
free and available and part
mm.
of their living world. Pharmaceutical medicine is very expensive and inaccessible for most people in the world. And so the plants are then what's available. I think it's
Absolutely.
easy to forget just how powerful that is. Herbal medicine is the medicine that we've always had.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I think that's so important. That statistic, 80% of the world use herbal medicine. That's something so important to remember. And also, like, these medicines, they're part of a lineage, they're part of a culture, for people living inside traditional societies and situations, that these medicines have been used for hundreds and thousands of years. And I think there's something so powerful and beautiful about that as well. Like the power, I think something really tends to hold power, whether it's a plant, whether it's an object, whether it's a word, something that's been used repetitively for hundreds and thousands of years holds such power. And I think that's beautiful as
Mm.
well.
Yeah, actually, I was re-listening to my interview with Jackie Bushell, one of the first ones
Mm,
I did. She's a herbalist and a mythologist, and she was talking about the power that myths hold is partly because they've been spoken so many times. And
yes.
they change subtly to make sense in the new context, but
Mm.
that repetition creates a kind of energy around them that makes them potent.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Recently, a little sidetrack, but it sort of kind of relates to that, is like I got my daughter christened. Now
Mm.
she's 10 months old, and I'm not a religious person at all. And, maybe 10 years ago, I would have balked at the idea of doing that. But now, I'm in a bit of a different place, a bit more mature, let's say, hopefully. And um, just to bear witness to something that I know has happened in a traditional sense for thousands of years, I found it
Mm.
so much more moving than I thought it would be. Initially I was just like, I'll just do this for my family, I'll do it for my parents, it'll make them really happy. It's something that they really believe in terms of a religious practice. But yeah, to bear witness to something, it was the same church that I had been christened in. And to bear witness to something, and seeing her be anointed with oils, and know that this practice had been done many, many, many times. I could feel the power of it, and I was genuinely moved.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah, the softening of our ideologies as we mature is a really beautiful thing.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were drawn towards herbalism because you already have a family kind of interest in health and medicine, and you
Hmm.
were very much focused on self sustainability and living in a self supporting way.
Hmm.
You studied in.
Studied online, and for the life of me, I'm drawing a complete blank as to the name of the college. I only did the advanced diploma, so I'm pretty sure that's been phased out now, and you have to do the full bachelor. I probably can't remember the name of it because, to be honest, I found it really flat and really dry and quite boring, which I know is something that a lot of students experience. And I don't know if that was particularly the institution that I learnt at, um, or whether that's a thing that goes kind of across the board. But I guess, like a lot of people, you become kind of enchanted or enamored by the magic of herbal medicine when you first start approaching it and thinking about it. And especially if you're, a really hands-on sort of person and you're growing the plants and you're tasting them and you're harvesting them. And then you sit inside a classroom. And I remember the classroom, the building that we were in was like an old military hospital, I think. um, and you could feel that, and it had like those bright halogen fluoro lights and like painted white brick. And it just felt so dead and so void of any of the stuff that attracted me to herbal medicine in the first place.
Mm.
And man, it was so boring. I would just be like slides and, pathophysiology, and this is hypothyroid, and like just bullet points on what it is, and like bullet point, and this plant is good for hypothyroid. And it really sucked the magic out of it. Not that like, I don't want to like, what's the word? Separate magic and science, or like that herbal medicine should like all be like super magic and enchanting and all this kind of stuff. I hold both those things.
It should
Go
be
on.
at least partly that, though, right?
At least partly that. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But it really did suck out also any of like kind of like the texture of the practice. It really sort of like flattened it.
Mm.
And it really felt like jumping through hoops to get to the end of it. And so many times I really questioned, like, do I want to do this? Because this really just feels like such a drag, And once again, this was like my personal experience, but I have heard that echoed from a lot of people
Yeah.
that have been through that institutionalized educational space. Is that something that you experienced at all?
Yeah, totally. I
Yeah.
studied, started off with Southern School of Natural Therapies that then got
Mhm.
bought out by Think, which then got bought out by Torrens.
Oh, yes, that's
So
what happened at mine as well.
yeah, and so then the quality of education dissipated throughout that
Mm.
process, and it very much felt like
Mm.
that. And yes, it was all about science, but
Mm.
science can be incredibly magical and very nuanced. And the
Absolutely.
science we were being
Mm.
taught was like science 101, like science for
Exactly.
dumb people or something. They weren't
Yeah.
teaching the science of hypothyroidism in a way that was actually interesting and engaging, looking
Yes.
at like, okay, so here's what research is showing us about the hypothyroid, and here's some really
Mm.
interesting research about how the thyroid interacts with the adrenals. And
Mm.
like it was very flat science. It wasn't
Exactly.
complex and nuanced. And
Exactly.
that's something that I think is really disappointing as well. If you're going to make the whole course about science, make it about interesting science.
Absolutely.
And bring some of the magic in. And I do feel for me, this podcast is part of that reclamation of the lost spaces of herbal medicine in our industry. It's
Mm.
I don't think we should be just throwing all of that out and saying it's all about our intuition. But there's a really potent part of the herbalist path that most people who are walking the path move towards it because of a calling in themselves to the kind of the wildness and the mystery of working with plants, and how the magic of the reality that plants are growing everywhere, that are producing these incredible substances that actually change how our bodies work, and can cause healing and support the healing. There's a magic inside that reality, inside the
Mm.
science of that.
Mm.
And I think nearly everyone walking this path, that's the call that they've had.
Mm.
And somewhere along the way, generally, people are being told that that call isn't right,
Mm.
and that you should turn that off, or that you're alone in that, and that
Mm.
the place to go to become a good healer is into a kind of flattened scientific approach.
Mm.
And then there's like, I think what I have experienced, and I've talked to other people who have experienced as well, you can graduate and feel like you're out of integrity with your own
Mm.
self, your own
Mm.
soul, right? You've like
Mm.
moved towards something for a very particular reason, and then you've gotten there and not found it.
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think there's so many different things in there to talk about. But I think what I've noticed, and I think what's really sad, is that there are people like us who enter into that system and then get spit out the other end. And what happens is you feel like there's no place for you then inside the industry, because the industry is or has particular qualities that I think operate in quite inside quite a narrow spectrum of what a practitioner should be, should sound like, should look like. Um, And I think if we don't have diversity within the industry, then there's like a whole amount of people who really want to engage in herbal medicine or natural medicine that don't see themselves reflected in practitioners as
Mm.
well. And I get really sad at what's lost when we flatten the practice in that way. And I'm so interested in, I think the way that we practice medicine reflects the way that our culture operates, right? Medicine doesn't happen inside a vacuum. It takes on and is informed by the cultural values of the time. And I'm so interested in what happened to the practice of herbal medicine, what happened to our education systems, so that our education became so stagnant. Basically, what's going on inside our culture that forces education to happen in a way that is so simplistic and basic and leaves no room for any of the magic or the mystery or the enchantment.
Mm.
Mm.
I'd love to have a crack at answering that question. I think a few
Yeah,
things have happened.
yeah, please.
Yeah, and first, I just want to really reinforce that point. You said that medicine, however you're practicing it, happens inside a cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find ourselves in a cultural context currently of there's a narrative that science technology will save the world. That the world
Mm.
is in at peril, and
Yeah.
human beings are in peril, and that science and technology is the answer to that peril. That's there as well, and there's a push in the industry to be validated and approved of by the dominant
Mm.
philosophy of life in our culture,
Mm.
which
Mm.
is very the body is mechanical, the
Mm.
universe is mechanical, and it's reductionist. And to be clear, what reductionist means is that we will understand things when we can understand the tiniest parts of that thing.
Mm.
I think we can use reductionist somehow as just like bad, but there's a place for reductionism. So it's like breaking something down to the smallest parts. So in herbal medicine, that's like when I know the exact active constituents of golden seal and when I understand how berberine works on cells in a petri dish, then I'll understand golden seal.
Mm.
And that's something, the desire to be validated by the medical establishment. I
Mm.
understand it, right? I also want to be approved of by the culture I exist inside. And I want the people who will come to me to trust what I'm saying and to feel confident in my knowledge as a health practitioner.
Mm.
But in our desire to be approved of, we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater and we've
Mm.
lost so much of the richness and the magic and our own internal philosophy around healing in the body that made herbal medicine work.
Mm. Mm.
It's almost like
Absolutely.
we've taken petrol and put in a diesel car,
Yeah.
But okay, we're just going to look at the body and healing through the lens of Western medical pathophysiology, but we're
Mm.
going to use herbs to fix it. It's
Mm.
kind of like matching up two different systems and then being
Mm.
confused why it doesn't always work.
Mm, yeah, that's such an interesting point, matching up by two different systems. I think what you were talking about there in terms of, it feels like I'd like to talk about those two different systems, actually. I think
Mhm.
that's really interesting. These kinds of two ways there's a myriad of ways to see the world, right? But in terms of like a broad discussion, two ways of seeing the world, this kind of linear, a simplistic, reductionist sort of approach that feels like it's more aligned with like the cultural values of modernity, right? They work really well inside capitalism. They work really well inside these politics that really focus on the individual, right? And the individual is the functional sort of unit of society, and how the individual, well, we come together like parts in a machine. And then there's this kind of other way of looking at the world, which I feel like the tradition of herbal medicine was really born out of, which feels much more circular in its logic, which doesn't nearly necessarily search for solutions, but rather focuses on processes and has much more of a kind of ecological way of thinking. So these kinds of webs of understanding, which I feel like is what is really lacking in our herbal education, kind of complex systems, and how the parts of that system relate to each other, not non-linearly, right? And those two ways, I don't know, I wonder if they're kind of reconcilable or not. What do you think?
Yeah, I think something that's interesting there is that you're pointing towards linear reductionism as being a way of seeing the world that really works with our cultural values currently. But then if
Mm,
you look in science, like in quote unquote cutting edge science,
mm,
and also sociology and cultural thinking, we have all systems thinking emerging. You've got
mm,
systems biology and all these kind of new fields emerging that are using an ecological lens to look at the body and our societies and how things work. But that's not currently the kind of cultural trend, you
mm,
know? And I think you're totally right that there are older and newer ways of
mhm,
looking at the world which sees us everything as in being in a relationship. And
mm,
I was lucky enough to study systems practice with a professor of systems thinking at University of New South Wales a few years ago, and he was saying, we have a tendency in our culture to look at the things as though they're important. But when you use a systems thinking lens, the things are less important than the relationships between the things. So it's almost
yeah.
looking at the spaces rather than the objects. And he now actually is really high up in the ATO using systems thinking approaches to improve what, getting more taxes and also giving a better like user experience, right? So, which
Mm,
is really interesting. So it's being used, systems thinking is being used at really high end places
mm,
now. And we were already thinking like that
yeah.
as herbalists,
Yeah.
and you can see that in traditional Chinese medicine, where they
Mm,
have all these ways of talking about the relationships, like, you know, metal is the mother of earth,
mm,
and the kidneys are in relationship with the liver in this way. And if the
mm,
liver has a problem, then you've got to look at both the kind of the mother of the liver and the daughter of the liver. So they're using
mhm,
family words to try and
mm,
describe this sense that everything is interconnected, and the way things influence each other is
mm,
almost more powerful than the things themselves,
mm,
And I actually think that's one of the biggest difference between Western medical thought and holistic medical thought, is that as natural healers and herbalists, we're actually looking at the way the body functions. We're looking at an illness as a functional illness. So, for example, if you are, IBS is a great example. So, IBS is like the intestines are functioning in a disordered way, but Western science looks at structural disease. So it's almost like disease is real when we can look at a part of your body with a microscope or an X-ray or some kind of imaging software,
mm,
some kind of imaging tool, and see structural changes in the tissue of that organ.
mm, mm,
So when we can see plaque in your arteries, we can point to a disease. When we
mm,
can see, liver cell damage, then we
mm,
can say you've got liver disease. But
mm,
holistic medicine isn't looking for the structural change, but how the behavior of things changes.
mm,
And so which is that systems ecological model versus the reductionist and linear model.
mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like a kind of poetic way of rendering that would be, that we see the unseen because relationships are effectively invisible. I think it's important that as a culture we practice standing inside different positions that other than what is habitual.
Mm.
So I think what's constantly being reinforced to us through media, through the images that we see every day, even through